Hi everyone, this video is to accompany the Encoder demo presentation. So during this video, I will be going back and forth between the Encoder demo presentation document, which is what you're looking at currently, and I will also be also showing the actual encoder screen itself. Give me 1 second, I just want to get the screen to fit. So this is the 3M encoder screen, and that is the encoder that I will be using throughout this demonstration. That's also the screenshots you will see in the encoder document in the course. So here in the course document, we are going through a case of a patient by the name of Susan Hall. It identifies that you need to pick out some information. You also need, when you go to the encoder, you need the patient's age or birthday. You need to know the patient's gender, and it's important that you have the admission date and the discharge date, because that does impact your MSDRG or your relative weight. So if you put a discharge date, for example, with the date of the year is 2019, if you were to code that same case with a 2018 admission and discharge date, you may have two very different relative weights. So the first patient we're looking at is an 81-year-old female. She comes into the ED with severe shortness of breath. She does have a history of congestive heart failure. She's admitted in October of 2018. Her status does not improve. Clinically, she begins to suffer from acute respiratory failure on admission. Per her advanced directives and family wishes, no heroic treatment was given, and the patient dies or expires on October the 3rd. 2018, discharge diagnosis, acute respiratory failure, and congestive heart failure. So within that case, you were asked certain questions. Of course, what are the ICD-10-CM diagnosis codes? That includes the admission diagnosis, the principal, and additional. You also were asked what were the POA indicators present on admission, and what's the final MSDRG and the relative weight for that MSDRG. Then you were given calculation or information on reimbursement. You were told that the hospital's base rate is $7,000. What is the estimated expected Medicare reimbursement for this patient, Susan Hall? So one thing you have to make sure you have done is you have looked at the course materials before you move to answer those questions. So we have the patient here. She's female. When you're at the encoder, it will default to the day of admission or the day that you're on it. It will also default always to female. So in this case, we're keeping that. We're putting in her age, which is 81. Everything here on the right, we are leaving the same. We're not changing anything. We're not changing the product or the grouper or the system. We hit continue. The next screen we get is the disposition screen. Per the clinical information, this patient died or expired, which is option 8. So we click that, and it automatically goes to the admission diagnosis screen. This patient was admitted with a diagnosis of shortness of breath. Remember that the admission diagnosis and the principal are not always the same thing. So in the example, I typed in the word shortness, and we're going to do that here. We have choice for 1. Then we choose breath, which is option number 2. And we are not coding anything else because this is only the admission diagnosis. This is not the principal. So we choose other, and we're given the code of R06.02, noting that we insert the decimal point where it is needed per ICD-10-CM coding guidelines, even though the encoder doesn't do so. As a coder and as a health information professional, you should be cognizant of the rules and standards of the coding system and the HIM world, which would be to include the decimal point in your speaking and writing of the code. You would not just write out R06.02 or say R0602. You would say R06.02. Now we need to continue on with our principal diagnosis. As we know, as coding students and coding professionals, we know the principal diagnosis is the diagnosis found after study to be the cause for admission. When we review the clinical information, the cause for admission for this patient was acute respiratory failure. You can type in either the word respiratory or failure. You could also, if you had coded this with a coding manual, as I noted in the written documentation for this case, you could type in the code that you got from the coding manual. But we're going to type in the word failure. And one thing you'll notice is sometimes it takes part of the word and automatically gives you some options. So we typed in FAI and it automatically gave us these three options. We're going to choose failure. And then again, this patient had respiratory failure, which is option number 7. And it is noted as acute for the clinical information. We're going to choose option 5. Then you give him 4 options: hypercapnia, hypercarbemia, and hypoxia, none of which are documented in our clinical information. So we're going to choose option 4, which is other or unspecified. In this case, unspecified. Then we don't have any identification of any of this information. We don't know if the patient was a smoker. We have no information about that, so we're going to choose 1. And this woman did not have any procedure. She had an advanced directive. It made her comfortable, but she did not have any surgical events or any type of diagnostic event, so we're going to choose 1. We are then given the code of J96.00. That is her principal diagnosis, which is acute respiratory failure. We also need to code, because it's there, when she was admitted, she has a history of and suffers from congestive heart failure. So we're going to hit continue. And we are given at this point a summary screen. It gives us our admission diagnosis and our principal that we have provided at this point. We can hit add diagnoses to add on the next disease, which is congestive heart failure. We're going to type in part of the word of congestive. We're given 6 options. We choose the one that matches what we are looking for based on our clinical information, which is 4. The next screen gives us various anatomical locations. This patient has congestive heart disease, which is option 4. We have no additional information if it's specific type of CHF, such as diastolic or systolic, so we're going to choose other or unspecified, which is 5. And again, no specific information is given other than she has CHF. He doesn't even say end stage. We're going to still choose other unspecified. Doesn't state if the patient has hypertension that's causing this. She doesn't have surgery as far as we know based on our clinical documentation. All your choices are made on your clinical documentation. Encoder cannot see what you're coding from, the source document. We choose 1. Again, this patient did not have any procedures. We choose 1. Diagnosis code is I50.9 for heart failure unspecified. We hit continue, and now we are back to that summary screen. At the top, we have some nosology edits. It talks about if we knew the information about her J96.00, we would code it, but we don't have that information. Remember, a use all additional code note can only be used if you have the documentation. Code first, you can only do that if you have the clinical documentation. If you hit the little plus minus sign, if you hit it and it'll collapse it. So at this screen, we have some information. We have a lot of information, but we still also need to get our POAs. If you hover over either the principal or the additional, you right click you can then see you can have several options that are in bold font. You can change if you wanted to change these two diseases, wanted to make the heart failure principal, you could do that and see what happens with that. But for our case at this point, we want to assign our POA, our present on admission indicators. The types of indicators are up the top, which are also discussed for you in the course lecture document. Your present on admission indicators are Y, N, U, W, and E. So the question is, was this patient's acute respiratory failure present on admission? Part of clinical information you were given in the case, the answer to that is yes. Was the patient's heart failure diagnosis present on admission? The answer is yes. She came into the facility with these two things going on. And then you hit OK. Now you have your POAs identified next to your ICD-10 CM diagnosis codes. And you are also back at the summary screen. So at the summary screen at the top, you have the MSDRG and you have the relative weight. You also have here the age of the patient that you entered, the gender, the admission and discharge date, and the disposition of this patient and the length of stay. Then that MSDRG information is repeated. You have 189 is repeated. 004 is the major diagnostic category. It is not the MSDRG. It's part of how the MSDRG, which in this case is 189, is arrived at, but the MDC is not what you report if you're asked to report an MSDRG. An MSDRG is this 3-digit number. If there was a 0, if it was 089, you would report 089. It is a 3-digit number. It is never a 2-digit number, it's never a 4-digit number, it's always a 3-digit number. So the MSDRG for this case is 189. Her mission diagnosis again is R06.02. You have her 2 ICD-10 CM diagnosis codes, you have her 2 POAs, and then you have some estimated reimbursement based on the base rate that's loaded in this 3M educational software system. But in the clinical information, or in the assignment, you were given specific information. You were asked to calculate the expected reimbursement based on a hospital base rate of $7,000. So here are the answers to those first few questions, which are noted on the screen. The relative weight again is up here at the top, 1.2353, and that's noted here in the document in the class. Then you must calculate out the base rate based on 7,000. So this particular hospital, in this example, in the written documentation, has a very high base rate. So most likely it's a trauma type hospital, maybe located in an urban setting. So it has a high base rate of $7,000. So you take the 7,000 and you multiply that by the relative weight, which is 1.2353, to get an amount of over $8,000, $8,647 to be exact. So that is the answer in terms of that is how much money the hospital, in this case, this one particular hospital with a base rate of $7,000 can expect to receive from Medicare or any other payer that's following Medicare's pay schedule. They can expect to receive $8,600 for this patient's stay. And then as noted, is now it's your turn to move on and code a case on your own, which in this case is case 2. It's a patient named Wallace Jones. He's admitted on 1/6/2019, so remember to put the correct day and year. And he ends up being discharged on 1/10. And you are given some information. This patient does have a procedure, so in addition to your ICD-10 CM diagnosis codes, you are also going to assign your ICD-10 PCS codes, and I will add that. You do have to assign an ICD-10 PCS code. You also have to identify your POA indicators for your diagnosis code. POA indicators are only on diagnoses codes. They are not on procedure codes. And you need your MSDRG and your relative weight. And we're going to use the same base rate, the same $7,000, to determine our expected Medicare reimbursement. To get to that, And once you've figured out what you're going to code, you have to read the clinical documentation first. But if you stay at the encoder and you hit next patient, you click OK. It's just reminding you of those nosology edits. Then you're back at the home screen. But this time you're going to have to change it to male. He happens to be 67. You're going to put in his admission date, which is 06, and his discharge date, which is the 10th. And then you hit continue and move on to coding that case. I hope this presentation has been helpful. You will find the answers to this case in the course lesson area.